She's like, do you ever just cut out Scott's rants? Do you ever just tell him that this is stop talking? We're never gonna air this.
I didn't say that.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore, and this is week whatever in quarantine. We're all just living in our houses all the time now. Thanks to my co-host for joining me via the interwebs, Bailey Perkins. How are you?
Hey everybody, I am well.
Thanks for being here. Scott Melson, hello sir.
What's up, man? How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for your service in the healthcare world yet again. Another week. I have two friends now who believe they have the COVID. They are not in Oklahoma, but I'm just waiting for all of my friends in healthcare for that to happen. God bless you all.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide if I've had it already or if I'm going to get it at some point.
Are you eligible to get one of those antibody tests?
I probably could. Yeah, I probably could. I should look into that.
Yeah, you should. So let's do two quick announcements, and then let's get into the coronavirus update. Listeners, as I mentioned last week, as a teaser, I'm going to go ahead and reiterate to mark your calendars for CivicsCon on May 29th. I had a meeting with our planning committee today. We are getting closer and hope to have the website and registration launched next week. Very exciting. We've got a bunch of guests lined up. It's going to be super rad. Secondly, for those of you who may not have seen it on our email list, for one, you should sign up for our email list. I don't spam you. I send like maybe one email a month usually, or on our social media, which you should also follow us on. Let's Fix This is making a plea that everyone register to vote absentee. Now, you've heard us talk about this for a couple of years now anyway, but honestly, has there ever been a more appropriate time to vote from the comfort of your own home than the middle of a viral pandemic?
I heard the president talk about it and how just much it gets corrupted and like how easy it is to just fake it and like how you should never be allowed to vote absentee unless you happen to be the president who wants to vote in the Florida election, but you live in Washington, D.C.
Is that what he did?
Yeah, that's what he did. And they asked him about it in a press conference, and it was pretty funny. He was like, "No, well, it was very good. It's very important. It was different, though. It's very different."
my vote's different.
No, it was funny because they said they were talking about vote by mail, and he was like, "No, I didn't do vote by mail. I did absentee. It's a totally different thing." It's like it's literally the exact same thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Voting absentee, vote by mail, vote from home, whatever you want to call it.
Tomato.
Mm-hmm. I have actually I've done it I think twice here, right? Like Oklahoma, one of the great things about Oklahoma's election system is that you don't have to have a reason to vote absentee, right? Like you can request the ballot, you get the ballot, you fill it out, you get it notarized. Andy will come notarize it for you, I bet. Aren't you a notary now?
I am a notary, but I want to speak to that. So that is true. So in Oklahoma, most people, anyone's eligible to vote absentee. Most absentee voters have to have their ballot notarized. However, from my reading of the law, it definitely seems like, well, for one, it's not in the law that we have to have an absentee or have to have a notarization component. I think that's just an election board rule. And so I believe that the election board secretary, Paul Zirax, is able to waive that rule under an election emergency declaration, which he's done for some other things, right? So I put this out last night in our email and social media, and several folks have responded and said, I called the election board today to ask about this, and they told me it's a law, it's in statute that would require legislative action. Now, I have looked through the Oklahoma statutes. I cannot find where that's the case. It definitely seems like it is up to the election board.
They didn't cite a statute?
No. But I mean, also like most people, like if you work the election board and you say, hey, someone called about this, and whoever says, oh no, we can't, that's the law. I think we all just assume Well, one, we assume that a lot of like agency rules are law. They're not. They're rules, right? Administrative rules are a thing that don't necessarily require legislative action, particularly in a pandemic, in a state of emergency. So,
Well, and either way, for our listeners, this is a great opportunity for them to reach out to their elected leaders, their senator and their House member, to add that extra pressure so that either the legislature can take that up because they still have a month to do business, or about a month and a half, actually, at this point, or they can have conversations and lift that pressure up to the election board to make that change.
that's exactly right. Now, I think if any listeners, anyone can find it in statute where it says that it's actually a statutory issue, please let me know. Hit us up on Twitter at Let's Fix This Okay, or send us an email, podcast at letsfixthisok.org. I would stand corrected, and I will correct you next week. But so far, I've not been able to find it. So anyway, elections.ok.gov or ok.gov/elections. Either website gets you there. Go ahead, go to the online voter tool, sign up. I have put a how-to video on our Facebook page. It's on Twitter. It's on our YouTube channel. And it was in the email I sent last night. If you're not sure how to do it, watch the video. I did a screen capture the whole way through it and re-signed up myself.
And Andy, and one recommendation I would give to the listeners after they sign up, it's great to send yourself like a reminder notice on January 2nd of every year, because you have to reapply every calendar year. So just because you do this now doesn't mean that you have absentee ballots for life, which would be awesome. But for Oklahoma, you have to reapply every calendar year. And so I try to do that right after the first to make sure that I get ballots for every election that I'm eligible to participate in through that calendar year.
Yeah, because you get the ballots early, which gives you more time to actually read them and kind of think about things, which is, I think, often helpful if there's races on there or issues that I'm not immediately familiar with. Also, you don't have to vote absentee. So I receive absentee ballots I've done it for the last couple of years, but I still like to vote in person. And so
it's a good cheat sheet.
Right. Yeah.
To take with you.
Yeah. Now you can print off, sample ballots and all that stuff too, but I like the reminder. And both my wife and I usually get it. And there's been cases where I received an absentee ballot. I planned to vote in person, but then I had to leave town on like the day before election day. And I, was like, oh man. And so I knew that as long as I got it postmarked by that date, it'd be fine. And so I quickly voted absentee. It's just a nice backup. So
this is a note, because somebody recently reached out to me on Twitter asking this question. When you get there to vote in person, if you had an absentee ballot, right? Like if you did this and you decided I want to, like Andy, I want to go vote in person, you will have to sign an affidavit at the polling place. And basically all you're doing is signing your name and saying, yeah, I had an absentee ballot. I didn't use it. I swear under penalty of perjury that I'm not voting twice. And you sign it and then you'll vote.
Yeah. No voter fraud. That's super rare. Not really a thing. Let's not make it a thing. All right. On that note, man, what a week. This week we saw the legislature suing the governor. We saw a reopen Oklahoma rally held at the Capitol and Penn Square Mall. Right, yeah. I saw several people joke, is this a give me liberty and give me death rally? Which I thought was particularly witty. And so, as has been the case in the last few weeks, the coronavirus pandemic continues to dominate the news cycle as well as most of our lives and our psyches. So let's start there, and then we'll move into candidate filing and this crazy lawsuit within our government. Dr. Melson, I'm going to go to you first for this. Give us a quick update on where we're at today.
Yeah. So I think in some respects, cautious optimism. Cautious optimism is a reasonable place to be in terms of where Oklahoma is in our coronavirus epidemic right now. The governor, if you've been watching his press conferences, he is saying a lot that we've flattened the curve, we flattened the curve, and there are ways in which that's true. There are the IHME models, which a lot of people have been relying on, seem to indicate that we've successfully started to flatten things out a little bit. There's some internal models that some of the hospital systems are using that would suggest a similar pattern. So I think in terms of flattening the curve, is to use the parlance that we've become accustomed to, I think there's reason to think that we have either done that or at least started to do that, right? One thing that I think is incredibly important for all of us to remember as we're talking about that, flattening the curve does not mean we beat the Rona, right? It's over, we beat it, she's all done, let's get back after it. This is more like if you were falling out of a plane, right? And you opened a parachute, that would slow down your fall, and you probably wouldn't die if everything went according to plan, which is good. However, if halfway down you took the parachute off and were like, "Yep, parachute slowed my fall down, life is good," and then you took it off, you would quickly fall to your death. So I think that's a reasonably good analogy for where we are now. Flattening the curve means that we have hopefully avoided, or at the very least forestalled a crisis, but we're still left with the underlying problem. But in terms of hospital capacity seems to be good. ICU capacity seems to be good. We seem to have access to PPE is improving. Access to critical care supplies seem to be in a reasonably good place. So yeah, I think cautious optimism in terms of where we are in the state of the epidemic is appropriate.
Right. I mean, it's like what you said, it is avoiding a crisis, but in some cases, in some scenarios, it may not even mean any fewer deaths or hospitalizations. It just means they're spread out over a longer period. And I'm sure, as you saw last night, Scott, Nate Silver from 538 was tweeting some analysis about this. And it looks like while in many models it kind of predicted a steep incline and then a steep decline in the number of cases or number of hospitalizations, the decline is not near as quick. So it ramped up, and it is in areas where they're kind of over the hump and the hump being the worst day, but not over that. The recovery is much slower, both in terms of healthcare and in terms of economic recovery, is happening much more slowly than what people might expect. And that's, I think, going to take some adjustment. So this all went from 0 to 60 really quick. It's going to go from 60 back to 0 over many, 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 many months.
Right. And the thing is you could still have had, right? You still could have had the steep incline and the steep decline. I think what's happened is that you had this really, really steep incline and it was arrested, right? But at the point where it's been arrested, it's going to be a slow gradual, because like you said, people are still getting sick. The reason it's so much slower, right, is because instead of having everybody get sick and then everybody either dies or gets better at the same time, right, what happens is a bunch of people getting sick and then you reach a steady state, right? And it takes a long time for that steady state to go down, right? So you have people that are coming into the hospital with coronavirus, but also people that are going out, right? You have testing supplies going up, supplies going up, and then more people coming in to be tested. It's this kind of flux, this homeostasis that's going to go down much slower, rather than oh shit, and then okay, everything comes back down to normal.
As Dr. Fauci's been saying, it's not a light switch, and it's not going to be.
Right. And I did an interview with Scott Mitchell the other day for his Mitchell Talks Facebook thing, and he referenced that I used to work in the HIV field and asked how this compared. I'm like, okay, first of all, it's very different, and the disease is very different, and the transmission modes are very different. But if you want to draw some comparisons or some parallels, I think how some of those waves have worked makes sense, right? Where HIV is still with us, and we have treatment, we don't have a cure or vaccine or anything, and so we still have 30 to 40,000 infections in the United States every year. Those numbers have declined over time, but it has been a very gradual decline. It is not near as steep, right? This is not like down in the 1% to 2% range. This is still a big deal. And so the fact that it's been 30 years since the peak of HIV, and we're still dealing with relatively the same number of cases, new cases per year as we did even 10 years ago, is a sobering reminder, right? That this was still happen. We still have 30,000 people that die every year from HIV, and we've had that for 30 years. And so I think with coronavirus, we need to start accepting and adjusting to a new normal.
Agree. Talking a little bit more about like kind of Oklahoma's like response to the epidemic and like what that looks like moving forward. I guess I put in our outline here, calling this kind of the state of play in Oklahoma. Like what are we doing right now? So the governor's been talking about how we've increased our testing capacity. We're testing more and more people, and that's true. So we're testing now on average. Now, this is a very rough estimate, and I'll tell you how I came up with this. In terms of knowing how many people we're testing every day, no one knows, right? Like as far as I can tell, on Twitter, on the health department website, on the governor's executive order reports, nowhere does it say we tested this many people today, we tested this many people yesterday, etc. What it does tell you, though, is each day it gives you the cumulative number of tests done to date. So I took, like, for instance, the number that were reported yesterday, subtracted it from the number that were reported on Wednesday, and assume that that is the number that were tested on Wednesday, right? There's some, there's going to be some fuzziness there for a lot of technical reasons, but I feel like that's a reasonable proxy. And I did that for every 2-day period looking back over the last 2 weeks and came up with an average of 1,440 tests per day. That is going up. The highest was the lowest was 265. The highest was 2,750. I think that a rough estimate of about 1,500 tests per day lines up with what we're seeing reflected in the rest of the data also. So that could be off, could be off by several hundred in either direction, but I think that that's a reasonably good estimate. So about 1,500 a day. We have currently about 86, a hair under 87,000 tests available. Now, one thing that's in the executive order reports, these also are publicly available. You can find them if you go to the health department and look under the news section. The health department is saying that we have 86,603 tests available. However, testing supplies are 41,327. That's obviously a difference of like about half. So I don't really know what the difference is between those two numbers. So whether we could test, if we needed to test 40,000 people today and tomorrow, could we test 40,000 or could we test 80,000? I'm not sure. But that's what's reported there. We have started doing serology testing. So testing for serology is another way to think of it, is another term for antibody testing. So the health department is testing swaths of 1,000 people, I think, at a time. They're randomly selected. It's supposed to be a representative sample of the population, and they're using an antibody test to try and determine if these people have had coronavirus, have antibodies to coronavirus, and therefore might have some degree of immunity. Chris Castile had a piece in the Oklahoman today talking about that first round of testing. Really, all it says was that we've started and we've tested the first 1,000 people and that there were very few positives. It doesn't say what very few means. It doesn't say how many there were. It also doesn't really tell anything about the characteristics of the test. I'll tell you that there are 3, as of right now, I believe 3 FDA-approved serology tests on the market being used around the country. There's something like 85 non-FDA-approved serology tests that are out and about that different states and municipalities are using to try and help determine prevalence of the disease in their communities. I believe the one that Oklahoma is using is one of the ones that is not yet FDA approved. And I say not yet because I don't, there have been some isolated reports of like these kind of like parking lot tech companies like selling antibody kits for $200 out of the trunk of their car. The FDA is moving quite quickly to try and crack down on those so people don't get scammed. I don't have any reason to think that the state of Oklahoma is using one of those. I think we're using a serology test that was developed in Norman. The accuracy of the ones that have been FDA approved is quite high, and I don't think there's any particular reason to think that the one we're using in Oklahoma would be any different than that. So there is antibody testing going on, and I believe the plan is to scale that up further. Lastly, and this is a number that's important that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, is what is the positivity rate of our testing here in Oklahoma? And it's about 7%. So what that means is when you look at all the tests that we've done and you look at how many are positive, about 7% of the total number of tests we've done have been positive. That compares with about a 55% positivity rate in New York. So something like 50% of tests in New York and New Jersey are positive. I want to say in like Detroit, I want to say it's like 30%. In Seattle, it was quite high. There's other places, Florida, New Orleans, around the country that are suffering kind of more severe outbreaks where the positivity is well over 20%. Nationally, our positivity is about 20%. So Oklahoma is below the national average in terms of how many of our tests are turning up positive. That is definitely a good thing. I think 7% is probably still high and reflects some sort of, some degree of bias. If you were to take that 7% and apply it to the population of Oklahoma and say that, right, 7% of the population has coronavirus, that would be, something like 300,000 infections as opposed to the 2,000-ish, 20. How many do we have today? I didn't see what our total positive was today.
I didn't catch it either. I think about that number though.
Our total positive cases is 2,357. So that would mean that we're underestimating the prevalence of the disease by about 298,000 cases. And so there's a lot of good reasons I think to think that 7% is still too high, but does reflect that our outbreak is in a much better place right now, at least, than some other cities and states across the country.
Man, so that's a lot of data, and that's really sobering, right? And I think, I'm sure our listeners have kind of been tracking this with us in similar manner. It sounds like, to summarize, right, we are testing more, but still not testing near enough.
Yeah. So I would 100% say that's accurate. One of the open questions is, what is a level of testing that we really need, right? And so I think, yeah.
Well, and I mean, a related question, I think, is what is the level of testing we need to move forward, right? If we're going to reopen things, what does moving forward look like? Now, you and I both, I know, listened to an episode of The Weeds about this that was very in the weeds. I had to rewind several times to re-listen to components. And I feel like most people, including our leadership and stuff, are starting to look at the future and okay, well, we've been doing this for a while. It feels like we're supposed to be around the peak or something now. When are we going to get out of this? And the answer is not good, but.
And I think it's a good time to segue into how this connects to the president's announcement yesterday of him wanting to have guidance to states on phases of opening government. And so with this conversation of we're testing more, but are we testing enough to have the right information to guide us on when we need to make decisions about when do we fall within these different threshold categories to be safe to move closer to, I guess, normal life and reopening government methodically and slowly. I'm making air quotes that our listeners can't see.
We can see them, Bailey.
But yeah, Scott, I would love to hear your thoughts on what you said means in connection to how our leaders move forward in their decision on methodically reopening government or
Yeah.
businesses and the economy.
I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that this is the kind of the magnitude of this question, right? Like, where do we go from here? Um, I don't really know if it can be overstated in terms of how big of a question it is, how important a question it is, and how hard of a question it is, right? Like we are dealing with something that I think is literally, quoting doing a Chris from Parks and Rec, literally unprecedented in our lifetime. So that's the first thing, right? So the idea that anyone like knows what we should do next, I think is there's ideas, many of which have merit. We're going to talk about 3 of them specifically, and I don't claim to know which one is the right one. I have some thoughts, but like this is a hard question. Andy, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, not only is this unprecedented in our lifetimes, it is, in my opinion, it is unprecedented in anyone's lifetime because the whole circumstances are different, right? The Spanish flu in 1918 happened more than 100 years ago, right? Like we didn't have the internet. We barely had automobiles. People were not driving around, right? Like we had way fewer people in way less dense situations, and it was still terrible, right? Like there's more people, more compact, more mobile, all that stuff. Also, we have the internet, which is great in lots of ways and terrible in lots of ways, right? And so we're also in the middle of a war, like, and so there was even that, if that's our closest example, is not a good parallel. Like it's
And the Center on Budget says, well, according to Nick Johnson, who's a vice president for the Center on Budget, made a graphic that says that the COVID-19 state budget shortfalls could be the largest on record. And so it shows that like the impact of COVID-19 is going to hit harder than the 2001 recession and even the Great Recession. So this is truly unprecedented.
So in terms of what do we do? Like, where do we go from here? I think Bailey, I think you're right. Like, it is reasonable to kind of start with. I'm not even going to dignify it with like the plan that the Trump administration released yesterday, and that is not entirely meant to be a dig at President Trump, but it's just like it's not a plan, right? It's basically saying to governors like, you guys decide what you should do for your states, which is their constitutional right and privilege anyway. And here's some criteria you can think about as you're making these decisions. So this is what they're calling their state or regional gating criteria. They're giving you can base it on some combination of symptoms, cases, and hospital capacity. So essentially, they're looking for states to have a downward trajectory of influenza-like illnesses reported within a 14-day period, or a downward trajectory of COVID-like syndrome cases that are reported within a 14-day period. So that's the symptomatic criteria. There's the case-based criteria, which is a downward trajectory of documented cases within a 14-day period, or a downward trajectory of positive tests. And this is really important. A downward trajectory of positive tests as a percentage of total tests done within a 14-day period, right? So you can't just have fewer positives because you're testing fewer people. You have to have either the same, like a flat number of tests, or an increasing number of tests. And what you want to see is that the percentage of positives, like the percentage of like positive tests as a percent of the total done, that is going down over 14 days, not the actual number of cases itself, right? And then the third thing is hospitals have the capacity to treat all patients without crisis care, and then a testing regimen in place for healthcare workers. So that's what we got yesterday from the administration. The podcast that Andy referenced earlier from the Weeds was the Weeds podcast by Vox Media, hosted by Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias. It's a fantastic show. If you're like wonky and into like super nerdy stuff, like white papers and budget analyses, it's a great podcast that comes out twice a week that you can listen to. But they had a very sobering episode this week where they looked at 3 Four technically, but really three plans for kind of what do we do next. So one is from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative leaning think tank. One's from the Center for American Progress, which is a kind of more progressive think tank. There's a study or a plan that Harvard's Center for Public Ethics, I think, the Saffris Center, they released a plan that's really very, very similar to the Center for American Progress plan. And then the third one that's a little bit out of left field, but it's very intriguing, is a plan by an economist named Paul Romer, who he's a Nobel laureate, really, I think, widely acknowledged as a brilliant guy. He's a professor at NYU, and he'll say this on his blog where he's publishing about the model. He's not an epidemiologist, like he's not a public health expert. He is a data and modeling expert, though, and he ran some really interesting simulations about testing. So a little bit of background, and we'll try, this is not the weeds, so I'll try not to get too dense here. And I want to be clear that like this, none of this is like my original work. I am piggybacking and hijacking off of hard work done by Matt and Ezra and their researches. But these plans really look at kind of three phases. So phase one being like flatten the curve and raise the line, right? So flatten the curve, we've all heard about. This is where you slow down the rate of new cases and try to make sure that hospital capacity doesn't get overwhelmed. Raising the line is physically increasing hospital capacity, right? We're trying to get to where we can take care of more people safely and effectively. And in all three plans, the American Enterprise Institute, the CAP plan, and Paul Romer's plan, essentially they say kind of some version of what we're doing, right? Really aggressive social distancing, people working from home, really going out to do things that are essential, and then massively increasing production and acquisition of PPE supplies, testing supplies, hospital capacity. The big difference is that Center for American Progress actually says if you really want to break the epidemic and break the kind of the trend, you need a national 45-day stay-at-home order. That they would have argued really should have started on April the 5th. And so this would be like the president coming out and issuing an emergency order, like similar to what Mayor Holt and Mayor Bynum have done here in Oklahoma City, what some governors have done across the country, but starting like everywhere across the country, shelter in place.
Can the president make that kind of order, or is our Federalism Society, or whatever it's called, Federalist system, prohibitive of that?
Andy, if you'd watched the president's press conference earlier this week, you would have known that the authority of the president is total. It's total. It's absolute. President can do whatever he wants.
But that is a great point. That it's an interesting time of teaching us where the lines of federalism lie.
Right,
like where authority is.
Because the answer is no, right? He doesn't actually have that authority.
So, I mean, hashtag not a lawyer. I don't think that he does. However, I think the president can do a lot of things under an emergency declaration, right? Like when there's a national emergency, I think that the president can maybe do some things that he or she can't do otherwise. And similar to what the legislature did here, like if the president was going to invoke some emergency powers, it would, to do something like that, to invoke a national stay-at-home order, I would honestly be a little bit surprised if the Congress didn't back him up on it, because there seems to be an acknowledgement from most people in most places that that's what's necessary. Because I mean, that's essentially what everyone is doing anyway. So it's an interesting question in terms of like the separation, not even the separation of powers, but like the federalist kind of system that we have here. What authority the president does or doesn't have to do that, but that's what they'd recommend.
Well, and I wonder too if there is, hypothetically, should the president want to make a decision that intently with a stay-at-home mandate, and Congress back him up. Typically, Congress is able to get states to oblige by the carrot and the stick. So let's say they were working on an additional stimulus package.
Right.
They could put some qualifications saying you have to oblige to this order in order to receive these extra dollars for whatever the case is. If it's through the PPP plan or for whatever, the Congress and the president could do that. So I think there is mechanisms to try to put teeth behind making that happen, but is the president going to use that level of authority is very doubtful.
Yeah, right. I think that's exactly probably exactly what happened. Is they'd say like, yeah, if you would like your hospitals to get extra money from the feds, then you'll comply with the stay-at-home order. But where these plans get really interesting is in phase 2, right? So phase 2 is like, how do we start emerging from lockdown? How do we start kind of trying to reopen businesses? How do we start trying to kind of restart parts of the economy? And I think this is an interesting place to focus on because that's kind of where we find ourselves in Oklahoma right now, or at least that's the discussions that we're having at the state level. So first, the plan put forward by the American Enterprise Institute, which, like I said, is more of a conservative leaning think tank. So for them, phase 2, they would say that a state or a municipality, but they're really talking about states here. A state can enter phase 2 when they have met certain criteria. So one, sustained reduction in cases for at least 14 days, right? And local hospitals are safely able to treat all patients requiring hospitalization without recording to crisis standards of care. And the capacity exists in the state to test all people with COVID-19 symptoms, along with the state's capacity to conduct active monitoring of all confirmed cases and their contacts, right? A couple of other criteria that they lay out is nationally the ability to conduct 750,000 tests per week. They want to see that states and cities have the ability to immediately double their ICU capacity and immediately double their ventilator capacity. They also want testing to be in place to determine immune status. Now, a lot of this, if you've been listening to the governor's press conferences, a lot of this may sound familiar. The governor had a press conference today. I wasn't able to see it. I read some of the excerpts, Bailey. I know that you were able to watch it. But he seemed to be focusing a lot on, one, we have the capacity to test everybody who has coronavirus-like symptoms. 2, we have surge planning in place with hospital capacity, specifically at Integris Baptist Medical Center and Integris Deaconess Medical Center combined with OU and Mercy, right? So there's surge capacity in place. 3, he keeps talking about how we flatten the curve and we see the curve going down. He's really not focusing on number of cases, though, right? When he says we flatten the curve, he continually is looking at the number of hospitalizations and ICU admissions, which is a bad metric, in my opinion, because they lag they're lagging indicators, right? So the number of hospitalizations and ICU admissions reflects where the epidemic was probably 2 weeks ago, not where it is now. And then, the American Enterprise Institute plan does not give a recommendation for how many tests a state should be able to conduct. They talked about how many tests we should be able to do nationally. If you took the American Enterprise Institute's, 750,000 tests per week that they recommend, and you were to say, okay, like what does that come out to? What does that come out to in Oklahoma? Well, we can take the population of the U.S. The population of the U.S. is 328.2 million people, right? So if we do 750,000 tests, right, and we divide it by 328, what does that give us? That gives us 2,286 tests per million people. Make sense?
Say 2,000 tests per million people?
2,286 tests per million people at the national level per week. Okay?
That's what they're recommending.
Right. So in Oklahoma, we have 3.9 million people. So that would be 8,917 tests per week, at roughly 1,500 a day times 7, right? That's 10,500 tests a week. So I think if you were to ask the governor, and I'm not friends with the governor, we don't hang out, but I would guess that this American Enterprise Institute plan is what the governor's looking at when he's thinking about whether or not Oklahoma is meeting the quote unquote data-driven criteria to start reopening our economy. And he would say that we've met all of those standards, other than a sustained reduction in cases for at least 14 days. Does that make sense? Yeah. The issue here is, so one of the main authors of this plan is a guy named Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who was the first FDA commissioner for President Trump. And he's a really, really sharp guy. So he's an economist by training, who then went to medical school and did an internal medicine residency, and has had a long and pretty distinguished career in public service. Like he's a sharp guy who's well respected on both sides of the aisle. He's definitely a conservative, definitely a free market guy. I listened to another interview with him, about an hour-long interview with Ezra Klein, where they talked about this plan in a lot more detail. And a couple of things that this plan kind of assumes. So one, this is not a plan that takes us back to quote unquote normal, right? It's very explicit where, like, if this is the steps you're taking and this is what you go for, it is envisioning that by the fall of 2020, you'll be operating at about an 80% economy, right? Like 80% of pre-COVID economy, which sounds pretty good. That's like a pretty severe depression, right? Like an 80% economy is like bad. Like that's like, no one I think would argue that is like a place you want to be in. So that's one thing. It does not get us back to where we should be, or where we want to be, I should say. Two, this plan assumes continued isolation, of particularly vulnerable populations. So people that are immune compromised, people that are older, people that have underlying chronic health conditions that put them at significant risk for coronavirus infection. This plan assumes that those people, either through recommendations from local governments or of their own accord and on the advice of their physician, are going to continue to self-isolate essentially indefinitely.
And that's a significant portion of our population. Like,
right. And
that's a lot of elderly folks. There's a lot of folks in America who have different medical conditions that make them susceptible. And I think we downplay how many people truly fall into that category that are in our workforce.
Right. And again, this is not me making this assumption. Like, if you listen to Dr. Gottlieb talk about writing this plan, he'll say like, no, that's one of their underlying assumptions. So, one, it's an 80% economy. Two, it's assuming that a large percentage of people are going to continue to be in isolation. Three, and this is where it gets like real sticky, this plan also assumes that there will continue to be more outbreaks, more hotspots. And it even goes as far as to assume that there are going to be like, you're going to kind of open things up, and then things are going to start to spike again, and then you're probably going to have to lock it down for at least some period of time. Like that, it assumes that for the foreseeable future, we're going to be moving in and out of these periods of like widespread mandatory and enforced social distancing, and then back into a period of like a more open economy. And you're going to kind of have to get used to fluidly moving in and out of those spaces. And Ezra brought up this point, and I think it's very critical to think about. That assumes, one, that political leadership is willing to acknowledge that's necessary. Two, it assumes that political leadership like is going to have the stones essentially to like do that. And three, it assumes that people are going to be willing, like that the populace is willing to accept that. And I think that all of those are pretty risky assumptions.
Especially as we see all of these rallies and protests happening, and we haven't even gone into some of these ideas. So
right. And then the fourth thing, there's several issues. And again, these aren't just me, like these are even things that Dr. Gottlieb brings up. Listening to the interview with him, there is a very real question about whether or not 750,000 tests nationally per week is a sufficient number of tests, right? And he even made, I think, a couple of references during the interview to like 750, like 750,000 tests nationally, like a day, as maybe more like what we would want to shoot for, which is significant, right? Like that's like an order of magnitude larger. So there are real questions about whether or not that is a sufficient level of testing even for this plan. And then the final thing, and this is what like I just have a lot of questions about. They emphasize the need for what's called contact tracing. So part of this plan would be, right, like Andy, like you get sick with coronavirus, like we notify the health department, and then somebody at the health department needs to call you and be like, all right, we need to know everybody that you've talked to in the last week because they need to get tested too. They are, because I think they're a conservative leaning think tank, they are very, very wary of the government getting too much personal information about who you are and where you've been and who you talk to and what you do and who your contacts are. They emphasize the need for contact tracing, but essentially like the contact tracing should be entirely voluntary and predicated on the cooperation of the person who tests positive. Their answer to that, though, is that you then, because you're the person who has the disease, would have to undergo some degree of enforced social isolation, right? So like we would put you in your house and you're not allowed to leave your house, and we're going to use either public health officials or like an app on your phone or an ankle bracelet or the police. Like all of those would be options to make sure that you stay there for 14 days until we decide you're well enough to leave again. And man, I have a hard time envisioning people in Oklahoma going for that.
Well, and Scott, not even just going for it, but for that scenario and even like increasing the number of tests that we need. You brought up a great point before that. Do we even have the capacity to do that? Right? Many of our agencies are struggling already to fulfill capacities of whatever needs and first responders. And so if we were to even need to take that step, not only is there not public opinion favoring moving to those solutions, but we may not even realistically be able to do it in a way that doesn't undermine the safety and security of the other things that are needed in our daily lives.
Right, and capacity is something that we'll talk about here in just a second because we talked about the other two plans. But the short answer is, in terms of the American Enterprise Institute plan, we probably have the capacity in terms of test kits, logistics, and supply chain to do testing at the level the American Enterprise Institute recommends. I don't know that we have, at least in the Oklahoma Department of Health right now. I don't know that whether we have the capacity to do contact tracing at the level that they recommend, and I don't know that we have the capacity to do even a partially enforced isolation protocol.
Right.
So moving to the Center for American Progress plan. This is the one that's, this is a more progressive or liberal, if you want to use that term, think tank. They recommend that there's this 45-day national lockdown, and after the 45-day lockdown is over, their criteria to move to phase 2, the monitoring phase, is you can move to phase 2 if testing and hospitalization, like that capacity, has been developed. Now for them, that capacity looks at really massive testing, and they specifically reference testing on the level of South Korea. So they would say any individual with a fever, every household member of anyone who tests positive, screening clinics at public health centers and drive-through centers, surveillance testing to monitor for new outbreaks in asymptomatic persons who are positive. So when they're talking about the level that they're talking about testing at, they're talking about 7,971 tests per million people, right? Per day. Okay. So we were just talking a few minutes ago about 2.2 thousand tests per million people per week. They're talking about 7,971 tests per million people per day. That comes out to 2.6 million tests per day, every day nationally. For a point of reference, right now, the U.S. has averaged 151,000 tests per day for the last week. So this would be like 1.5, like 100, not 100, 10, 15 times. Yeah, 10 or 15 times what we're doing now. They also recommend serology testing for immunity. in terms of an isolation protocol. So they would actually recommend much more stringent and mandatory contact tracing. So like if you test positive, there's an app that gets put on your phone, and then the public health agencies are going to use this app. This is what has been done in South Korea to essentially trace all of your contacts. Your phone is going to ping any other phones it's been come into contact with. It would be a level of sophisticated kind of monitoring that doesn't exist in this country right now, and that I think would be difficult for people to accept. And that's not even talking about trying to develop the supply chain and logistic capacity to test 2.5 million people all across the country every single day. The third, we're going to skip the Harvard plan because it's really essentially the same as the Center for American Progress in a lot of important ways. The third plan by Paul Romer that I think is really interesting is arguably the simplest, but by no means the easiest. So he says that you would continue social isolation until we have enough testing. In Paul Romer's mind, what is enough testing? You would test everyone, and everyone means the entire US population, roughly every 14 days. We would require at least 22 million tests per day, potentially as many as 35 million tests per day. And this would continue until we have an effective treatment option. And now, once we have that level of testing capacity, essentially everything could go back to normal because we'd be surveilling the entire population for a new outbreak every 2 weeks. So the Romer plan is the biggest moonshot in terms of like supply chains and logistics and like developing the testing capacity. But if you do that, normal goes back to like life as we know it, essentially immediately.
It is so overwhelming to me, right? Like the scenarios that lay before us and the uncertainty in what's going to happen. Like there's a lot of ways this could go right. There's a lot of ways this could go wrong. One thing that Scott, I think we kind of touched on, but glossed over to talk about these plans is that a lot of the focus has been on testing people. Like here in Oklahoma, the focus has been on testing people who are symptomatic, even though last week and the week before, the thing that dominated was the fact that a huge chunk of infections come from people who are not symptomatic, right? So it seems to me that until we start testing people who, like just testing everybody more broadly to find out if they have it or not, that we're never going to be ahead of this. We're going to always be playing catch up to someone who's been infectious for a week or two and has been out there spreading it, and you can never get ahead, right? Like the early detection is key, and we're always doing late detection. That seems like the wrong way to do it.
Yeah, I mean that's 100%. That's 100% accurate. And this is why, like, of these three things, I'm a fan of the Romer plan, right? Like it does, like the Romer plan only requires like new, technological advancements in terms of maybe building, developing new supply chains and building, factories. Like the Romer plan is stuff that we know how to do, but it's doing it on a scale that we've never before attempted. And so it's like, it's kind of a moonshot in that sense, but it's also like, it's not dependent on, like, there's no go back into lockdown, come out of lockdown, go back into lockdown, come out of lockdown. There's no like put an app on your phone and, let everyone know where you are forever. There's no like, oh, you tested positive for this disease. Like we're going to put an ankle bracelet on you, make sure you don't leave your house for 2 weeks, right? Or longer, because you can be symptomatic with this infection for 3 to 4 weeks and not be in the hospital, right? Like I have patients that are in that situation. And so this is a to me, this is a like, that should be the answer, or at least the one that's most attractive, because it's something we know how to do. We just have to figure out how to do it at a scale that we've never done it before. And we have people that are really good at that. Right. Right. And honestly, it may be the cheapest. The cost estimate for the Romer plan is like $100 billion, which is a lot of money, but the economy is losing $350 billion a month right now, right? Like, and that's one thing that I think doesn't get said enough is that, like, you know, there's a lot of like Twitter and Facebook chatter about like how all these scientists and doctors and like public health people, they just don't care about that. Everyone I know, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, is desperate for this to end because we cannot sustain this level of economic inactivity for like 12, 18, 24 months, which is how long it's going to take to have a vaccine in all likelihood, which is when this is, and a vaccine is when this is like over to the extent that it's over, right? So like we need a sooner answer. So like we can work on something new, or we can take what are like half measures, which is what I really feel like the American Enterprise Institute plan is. The AEI plan is half measures for the sake of trying to do something now, rather than like putting all of our eggs in the basket of something that like is truly manageable for the long term, even if it's a little bit harder problem to solve, and going to take a little bit longer. So anyway, that's, you know, we're like at almost our whole time now, and it's mostly just been me talking.
Well, Scott, and before we get off this topic, I just wanted to add, it is also about how we message things to the American public. I think a lot of times, especially over the past nearly 2 months, there's been a lot of fear and uncertainty, and I think Americans really embrace consistency. And so if the plan from The Economist that you were discussing brings a level of consistency that doesn't cause us to go from fire to non-fire, fire to non-fire, you know, every other week, I think it's
Right.
something that Americans could potentially get behind.
Right. Like it's you know, it would, I think, manage this in terms of hospital capacity. I think that's the way to go.
It feels like every week there's so much information about this that we're all learning. So Scott, thank you for taking the time to make this. I will put all of this information, a little table that you put into our doc here, I'll put it into the show notes. So listeners, if you listen to this, if you go to our podcast webpage, it's on Captivate. We kind of use their built-in page, and you can read all the show notes in there. It's real handy. That's kind of why we shifted over to that. So if you want to print this out and show your friends, I'm sure your spouse would be very interested at the dinner table to talk more about coronavirus.
I mean, who isn't, right?
Right. All right. Well, let's take a moment to pivot back to Oklahoma politics, because it has been quite a week. As we were preparing, I told Bailey, here's how long this week has been. It was Tuesday that the House and Senate sued the governor. And we both were like, what? That was this week?
That's insane.
That's only 4 days ago. So, so on Tuesday of this week, the House and Senate filed a lawsuit against Governor Stitt. Basically, so this is the next step, right? Next phase in this budget battle that they've been having that's gone on for, has it only been 2 weeks? Maybe 3 weeks?
2 weeks.
Only been 2 weeks? Holy moly. How old am I?
Everything's longer during coronavirus.
April is 500 years long.
It is.
So, yeah. So last week, you know, it's probably worth an update, right? Last week, the legislature met. It was last Monday. So almost 2 weeks at this point. And probably by the time the listeners are listening, it's been at least 2 weeks. They met separately with that whole weird system where they only had 10 people in the chamber at a time. And in between the House and Senate meeting, the Board of Equalization was supposed to meet and declare revenue failure. And they gavelled in and gavelled out, right? Like they started the meeting and then immediately ended it, like within 30 seconds, because the governor or someone on his team noticed that the budget bill that had been put out there, the emergency funding bill, did not fund his digital transformation fund. And so, depending on who you ask, it sounds like most people consider the amount of money they're arguing over to be about $250,000 into a non-essential fund. The governor says it's more than that, but it seems like still less than $1 million, a tiny portion out of $400 million that they were dealing with. and that stalled things out. Now, the legislature went ahead, the Senate went ahead and passed all the bills. So all 3 bills went to the governor's office, and he signed one. Ended up signing 2, and then said the third one he was not going to sign.
Which was the bill that would actually move the monies from the rainy day funds to the general revenue.
It's like he was trying to do a pocket veto, but that doesn't exist in Oklahoma.
Right. It's a pocket sign. He got bamboozled on that deal, right? Before sine die. I think it's a pocket veto after sine die. Isn't it? Doesn't it switch?
Right. Yeah.
That's a weird system. So in Oklahoma, in order for the legislature to be able to move money from the rainy day fund back into the main account, the general revenue fund, the Board of Equalization has to declare revenue failure, and then they can do that. But since the board didn't meet last week and didn't declare it, they can't move the money. They passed the bills. The governor didn't sign it, but he didn't veto it because the legislature said, go ahead and veto it. We got the numbers. Like, we can override your veto. So he just let it slide, which is the same as signing it. So it goes into law. And so now they have filed a lawsuit saying, you didn't sign it, but you didn't veto it. So it's still into law. And now we believe we are legally forcing the Board of Equalization to meet, because the law that is now on the books has passed is that this money has to be moved. And so now we have to have this step of the Board of Equalization meeting to declare the revenue failure. We all know it's there. The governor said it's there. He just was like trying not to do the thing. This is like arguing with your kids about, who knocked the picture off the wall. It's not me, but they're standing there with the basketball and there's like a basketball print on the photo or whatever. And you're like, I know it's you, man. Like, you just got to do it.
Earlier this week, I was on a call that had Representative Jason Dunnington, and he explained it really well. Because I had the question of, should the Supreme Court not rule in favor of the legislature and the monies remain in limbo, what happens from here? And Representative Dunnington explained that state services are funded through the month of April. So the legislature would then have to either come back and make a decision on how to make things work to get the governor's signature, to then make sure that agencies are funded for May and June, or those agencies would take massive cuts because the money would be sitting there, but it wouldn't hit. It's almost like when you're looking at your bank account and you see like pending, but the money's not actually there, right? And so for the money to actually drop for state agencies to be able to use those funds, that Board of Equalization would have to set that revenue failure. So it's a really unique time, even during a pandemic, in the Oklahoma legislature.
Well, and what a weird time that the legislature sues the governor. It's not even the major story, and 3 days later, we've all since forgotten it, right? Because other stuff's going on. One final note on that is that the Board of Equalization is scheduled now to meet next week on April 20th, right? The governor went ahead and called it, and so there's some question of like, well, does that mean the governor's given in, right? Like, if the legislature was going to sue him to force this meeting, and he's going ahead and calling it, maybe it's all going to work out okay. Yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap up on kind of one last legislative note. That last week was candidate filing for all the legislative seats and congressional seats. So everybody in the state house and a third of the state senate are up for re-election this year. So there's altogether, including congressional seats and a couple other, there's one corporation commissioner seat. But altogether, there were 148 seats that were up for re-election. And initially 46 of those were unopposed. Since then, I've seen at least one where an incumbent dropped out and left the challenger unopposed. So that would be 47 of those unopposed. And it may be that there's a few extra once all the candidate challenges are worked out, right? So, once someone files for office, someone else can challenge and say they're not eligible because they don't live here or for whatever other reason. And so some of them would get thrown out. So it'll be likely, just shy of 50 or around 50 out of 148 seats. So 100, basically a third of the seats are unopposed.
That just gave me a migraine.
It's just not healthy for democracy.
Right. I mean, that effectively means people filed for office and were elected on the same day. No votes will be cast in favor or against them because there was no opposition.
Right.
Now, the last couple of years, this was not the case, right? We had a lot higher number of people that filed.
It was upwards of 600. It was a record number.
Mm-hmm. And I think, the last two cycles, right? So 2016 and 2018, we saw in some cases as few as like 16 seats being left unopposed. So a third of what we have here.
To what extent do we think that the Rona is influencing people filing? And because so you can't campaign, or at least not traditionally, right? Like you can't knock doors right now, and may not be able to for the foreseeable future. You can't fundraise traditionally, right? Because you can't have
house
have
parties,
more than 50 people and house parties and whatnot. So I wonder how many people were maybe thinking of running and just aren't because they don't have the infrastructure as a non-incumbent and can't build it in this environment.
Right. Or they have another job that was going to help support them, and that job, went away and no longer exists, and they can't afford to run now. I think all those things are definitely possible. And so that's, I would imagine, part of it. Looking back,
that's a small part.
Yeah, someone put on Twitter like a graph of the number of unopposed seats over the last decade or so or more, and it seems like this number of unopposed seats is fairly on par with what it's been for the last 10, 12 years, with the exception of the last two cycles, of course. And so it seems like this is kind of the norm, and certainly, there's arguments to be made that, some of these seats are unwinnable by someone or whatever. But regardless, I think, Bailey, to your point, and Scott too, I feel disappointed. I would like to see some democracy in action. And as I've told some state representatives who I am friends with and support and want them to win, I still want them to work for it a little bit. Because I think there's something to be said for the electoral process that's like an iron sharpens iron kind of deal, right? Where it helps you be better, right? You were confronted with other people's opinions. You got to knock doors and talk to voters, and it gets you in front of people in a way that you might not otherwise. And I don't want anybody up there feeling like they got a big head because, well, no one ran against me, I guess everyone likes me. That's not necessarily the case, right? Which brings me up to one of my soapbox issues, and that is the phrase, vote them out. Because we don't vote people out. We vote for someone different. There is no vote of no confidence, right? If you don't like your state legislator, you can vote for somebody else or not vote for them, but there's no way that you don't vote against them. There's not like a no vote, right? That's not a thing. And so if you don't like somebody, you got to run against them or you got to find someone to run against them so you can vote for that person.
Well, Andy, it creates this cycle, right? We complain all the time about low voter turnout, but then we have uncompetitive races and we don't give people an option, which then makes them say, why should I vote? So in order to increase voter turnout, we have to give people a reason to want to turn out. And oftentimes it is competitive elections, and that's something that we haven't had historically. We've had events that have driven people to the polls. So the teacher walkout, the budget situation from a couple of years ago inspired people to turn out to run for office. There are other ways that people can file as well. So that's why I don't know if it's just COVID-19 that made people say, oh, I'm not going to run this year. Because you could submit your paperwork and mail it in. And so there's other ways to be able to file for run for office. I just think we're back into that slum of um, apathy. And so it's how do we get people motivated again to run so that we can inspire people to participate? Because there's a lot of times in previous elections where people are like, nobody has ever knocked my door before. Why is that? Because in your district, your state representative is already selected. So there are no doors to be knocked. And so there's not a reason for that level of engagement, at least with competitive elections. You're going to hear from folks like in Congressional District 5, you're going to hear from all kinds of folks because there's a lot of people running in that seat. You're going to hear a lot from the sitting Congresswoman. And so the more competitive races you have, the more you'll hear from people who want your vote and you can be more engaged in government. So we have to fix that problem somehow to make races competitive again, but also increasing turnout and participation.
Right. And I think, an example I think of why it's important to even file, right, is a couple of years ago, the former Democratic leader, Copeland, right, like someone filed against him, did nothing, no website, spent no money, just sat on his couch and won, right? That probably says a lot about that district. But the fact that someone went from being a leader of a caucus to not in office and the other guy didn't do squat means like, you know what, if you just throw your hat in the ring, right? Like, I don't remember who that was now, but because that guy's got to be in office and running again, right? I need to go look that up. So hopefully for next week, we'll have a little more analysis. And, we had looked back previously at some historical data for the number of seats that never had a challenger, not a primary challenger, not a general challenger. And I think Oklahoma stacks up higher than some other states. So I'll take a look at that. As a reminder, Bailey, you wanted to remind listeners about reaching out to lawmakers during this time?
Yes. This is a great opportunity to connect with lawmakers. There's usually a hierarchy that many folks involved in advocacy use to help people understand the best ways to influence lawmakers. We usually say, visiting them in person and then sending a letter and then doing this and then doing that. And usually social media is at the bottom of the rung. But actually, COVID-19 has created a unique opportunity where a lot of our lawmakers on every level, local, state, and federally, are using social media and virtual town halls more frequently than ever before. And so now is the best time to follow that lawmaker, whether it's at the city council level, or your school board member or your member of Congress, to follow them on Twitter, get on their newsletters, tune into those town halls, send them messages on social media, because all of their time and attention is focused digitally right now, because that's the only way that they can interact and touch the public. And so this is a great time to even, Andy, you mentioned this, that even getting to know candidates, because social media is going to be the only way that they're going to be able to engage during this time in the outbreak. And so you have a real opportunity to build relationships and raise issues that are most important to you because they're using these different platforms.
Yeah, we are trying to get an email list of candidates. So on the candidate packet, there's a blank for their email list. However, the election board doesn't provide that in the spreadsheet. They just do their home address and phone number. And so I know groups like the League of Women Voters basically divide it up and sit down and call through all of these candidates and try to get their email addresses. I don't know why the election board doesn't type them up. Maybe they just don't want to, but presumably it's all public record. So we should be able to submit an open records request. It would be really great to be able to provide candidate email addresses so that it makes it easier for folks to contact them in their area. If their home address and phone number are listed, it seems like email is the the least privacy concerning thing on the list. Also, I just think there's, especially in this day and age, a lot of reasons to have that out there. In the past, we have tried to, make a list of all the candidates' social media and Facebook pages, and that is, without a small army, just not possible, right? With 140 or 100-ish seats that are up, and each seat, many of them have 2 or 3 or 6 or 8 candidates, and not all of them, but a bunch of them do. That means it's really hard to track down everyone's pages. And at this point, a lot of folks don't have anything. They don't have websites, don't have Facebook pages. So if anyone out there, any listeners want to take this on as a project, if you're stuck at home and want something to do, let me know. I'm happy to help, and we can maybe get some interns to help out with that or something.
You could also build them like websites and Facebook pages.
Yeah, if you are a campaign consultant or graphic designer, now's the time. Reach out to them and be like, listen, a good website will help you get a long way in this world. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you, Bailey, for being here.
Absolutely.
Scott, thank you, sir.
Always.
Listeners, please don't forget to subscribe and rate Let's Pod This on Apple Podcasts so it helps other folks discover us. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Let's Fix This OK. Scott is at SC Melson. Bailey's at Bailey M. Perkins. I'm at Andy OKC. And like our Facebook page at facebook.com/Let's Fix This OK. Our website, letsfixthisok.org. Sign up for the newsletter. Find out about things. And make a donation. Help us keep doing this. As this is costing us more money per month than normal because we have to pay for this service to do it from home and get good quality. We are a member of the Mostly Harmless Media Network, and our theme music is Rhino Punk by artist So Down. Let's Fix This is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization who strives to educate and equip all Oklahomans to engage with the government. We encourage you to get involved any way you can. And remember, decisions are made by those who show up. Be safe, everybody.